Hello, everybody. Welcome to TMBS. I'm doing a Griscom stream. I was able to do these about once a week, going into August, and I'm hoping to get back on the horse with it. So I'm really happy that y'all are here. For people who aren't familiar with these, these are an opportunity to sort of check in. I love to answer questions, so please hit us up with super chats or throw questions into the chat. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can, and just go over a couple of topics in a kind of more informal setting. Thanks for all of the support we've been getting recently for TMBS. It means a lot to Matt, myself, and Alicia, and the whole team going forward. I just actually finished doing a really interesting interview with Seneca Savoy, who is a member of DSA in the DSA leadership, actually, in Austin. And we were talking about their movement to defund the police. For people who aren't familiar, in Austin, they actually were able to get a significant cut to the police budget there. But that's a fight that is going to be ongoing. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. One, to make sure that it sort of meets the goals and the expectations of people who are fighting for it, and two, to defend it from all of these, outside groups now that are coming in and trying to descend on Austin to, push for a more barbaric and well-funded police system there. And, a couple more announcements as people are sort of showing up. Again, for people who are just joining us, jump into the chat, ask questions. Really appreciate super chats. YouTube, as you all know, is always difficult with all of us with our shows, and we get demonetized all the time. So this is a really great way for us to make sure that we're keeping the YouTube channel, all the people who work on putting these videos up for us, paid. And speaking of YouTube, I've been doing videos for Jacobin as well. So if you haven't checked those out, definitely do. They're all on the Jacobin YouTube channel. They're called Quick Takes. I've done, my first one was on one of my personal heroes, Paul Robeson, and the question was, are socials against greatness? The second one was lessons from Fred Hampton, why political theory is for everyone. And the one that just came out was basically pushing back on this kind of red state, blue state divide that the frame that people use to think about politics in the United States, which I think is very harmful, especially for socialists. So definitely check that out. All right, I'm getting some of these chats here. So why don't I jump into them to start out. Hey, Paul. Paul asked me a question about monetary reform. I think I might be mistaken, but you've been sending me a few things on this. I'll definitely check it out and look into what you've been sending us. It's definitely an interesting thing. It's important to remember that monetary reform, even though that's something that sounds sort of esoteric, that was fundamental to the populist movement in the United States, was pushing back against a monetary system that was really hurting workers and predominantly farmers. So for sure, we'll definitely jump into that. Let me see here. I got somebody said, thank you for platforming the Juchi Gang Co-op. Yeah, I realized that was the group. I don't know much about them or anything, but I know that they hosted the Parenti video that we put up on the channel the other week, and I definitely got a kick out of the name. So let me see what we got here. David, from a former Austinite, I miss Austin, though now I just want to move out of the country. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I hear you about missing Austin, but I still think that, people should try to, stand up and fight for this country and not flee. I think that, this is our place to echo Paul Robeson. It's, this is my home, and no fascist-minded politician is going to push me out. All right, so now we're starting to get some good questions here. Again, if you send us super chats, it's a lot easier for me to read as these are going forward. But before we jump into too many of these questions, actually, I wanted to mention the Supreme Court, because I think that's going to be a lot of the questions that we're talking about. Last week's commentary, I was talking about the importance for socialists to start to think more radically about how we're going to deal with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a really nasty anti-democratic organization. If you even look into the political philosophy, the whole idea of having a Supreme Council basically above the will of the people is an anti-democratic idea, that the people are not equipped to understand, politics and make their own decisions, and they need to sort of be led by elites, even if we have a nominal democratic system. on that basic level, that should be something that you should understand as a socialist is a system that you want to get rid of. And the actual strategy of how we fight that is going to be a little bit more nuanced and difficult. But what we first need to do is we need to start doing as much work as we can to discredit the Supreme Court in the eyes of the public. It's very funny to listen to liberals. You even see people like Pete Buttigieg and all these people coming out with these like sort of half-assed ideas to reform the court. Now, obviously, Pete Buttigieg's idea is nonsensical. He basically says that we're going to have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and then 5 nonpartisan judges, which just shows how vapid the liberal mind is, that they think that these kind of institutions are going to operate on a non-political level. But the fact that even somebody like Pete Buttigieg, a very, very corporate centrist Democrat, is talking about changing and reforming the Supreme Court, that's an opening for us, and we need to continue to fight and to push our message forward that the Supreme Court should not have the ability to overturn laws passed by Congress. I got a question here from Derek about any thoughts on the recent national strike in Colombia and the police protests there. Any thoughts on the new farm reform bills in India? Derek, I don't know too much about the strikes in Colombia. That's something that I'll definitely look into, and I'll definitely cover that next week on TMBS. And similar thing, unfortunately, with India, I'll have to look into that too. But I really appreciate the super chat and the suggestion there. Andrew Wavell asks, how long do you think Trump can keep bailing out the stock market before it crashes? Solidarity from the UK. Well, remember, this is, when it comes to the stock market, a lot of that is coming from loose monetary. Thanks again, Derek. Loose monetary policy that's coming from the Federal Reserve. So obviously, Donald Trump is putting a lot of political pressure on the Federal Reserve to continue, its policies of very loose monetary policy, which essentially means that money is very cheap. So you have low interest rates. And that means for people, to use a kind of abstract way of thinking about it, it's like people who have access to being able to, to significant amount of money, credit lines, it's really easy for them to take out money. And then they're able to use that to fund their day-to-day operations and things like, buying stocks even. So what happens in this kind of situation is that, there's a lot of money basically floating around, and because it can't find returns in, basic kind of like loan activities, right? Because interest rates are set so low, then it goes into things like the stock market or other, assets that are going to have a higher return. And that's why you've seen this kind of bizarre relationship in this country where, the day-to-day economy for typical people is very miserable. We have massive unemployment. Consumer spending is going down again. The earliest reports that we've been seeing now that like unemployment benefits have been cut, that consumer spending is going back down. So anyways, you're having this moment where like there's such a dismal experience for most working people in this country. And then you see, stock prices continuing to go up. Well, that's because, people who have money, are operating on a completely different logic, and they have access, to cheap money essentially. And that's going to mean that we're going to continue to see the stock market rise completely decoupled from the experienced people on the ground. So there will be a moment one time when, that gets corrected, but I don't foresee that happening anytime in the future, near future. I think Trump will be able to ride that out. And on the same kind of question, subject, Daniel Krieger asks, any chance in hell we get another stimulus check? Boy, do I hope so. I can't understand the situation that we're in right now, just on a basic level for any government in a moment, obviously, of such uncertainty, to not be providing the kind of basic safety net that you would expect a country like the United States to be able to provide for its citizens. The problem here is that, as Republicans said, the stimulus check was too good for so many workers in this country. So many people really are living paycheck to paycheck, and being able to get an extra $1,200 in their bank account was significant for a lot of people, as were, the extensions of unemployment benefits for folks. So you're seeing this, really nasty pushback from Republicans on it. But at the end of the day, you just have toothless Democrats who aren't going to stand up or fight dirty in the way that you have to in modern American politics to get anything done. They are just not that interested at the end of the day at fighting for people. I don't think it's, I mean, I don't want to bet against it because I want it to happen. But I think it's looking less and less likely that we get that unless it's some kind of deal for a Supreme Court appointment from the Democrats. But I think that could get really nasty really quickly as well. So, fingers crossed, but we're going to have to take care of ourselves on this one, I think. Comrade, Quantum Movement, is Starfleet imperialist or socialist? I'm sorry, I don't know. That is it a game or a show? Sorry. I wish I did. I don't know. Are we talking about I just looked it up. I'm not a big Star Trek guy, I'm sorry to say. I missed that. So anyways, thanks for the super chat though. So I couldn't give you an answer on that. Out of Gas asks, love the show. I need help with my TMBS store order, but I can't get a hold of anyone. How can I get a response? Would love to buy more merch. I mean, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I don't know how you've been reaching out to people. Oh, by the way, we get DMs to our show account. I'm trying to answer those as much as possible, but it's a lot easier to come to me or Matt directly instead of going to that, because it's just something that's not being monitored very closely right now. But when it comes to store orders, those are getting shipped out right now, and some people have been getting them recently. You just have to understand that because of COVID, obviously the tragic loss of Michael, and the fact that we work with a union print shop, things got very significantly delayed because we got a huge amount of orders. And then obviously there were a lot of technical things that we sort of had to figure out immediately after. But those are coming, and people have been receiving them. Thanks again for your patience. I know people have been waiting for a long time for those, but they are all are coming out. And I think when it comes to replenishing stuff, I think that's on its way now. I think the first goal is to make sure that we can get everything, all the orders fulfilled, and then start restocking again. Let me see. Let me get. Billy asks, can you explain the US dollar as the reserve currency in relation to Federal Reserve printing? Inflation. I'm sorry. I mean, there obviously like an increase of inflation, a massive increase of inflation would have significant, effects on the global economy. Not all necessarily bad for folks, especially internationally. For example, if you have your debt denoted in US dollars and there's significant inflation, then that becomes less money in like real value for you to pay. So that could be something that would be helpful for international, especially for debtor countries. But obviously for people who hold those debts, they'd kick and scream. So I don't see a massive inflation coming in the near future. By the way, the Federal Reserve, that's like their primary goal, is to stop inflation. And that's because the people that they answer to are wealthy people and not necessarily, poor countries or working class people. But if you continue, I don't know, if you ask me again in some other way, I might be able to go into more detail to sort of get at what you were wanting to hit at, but appreciate the question. Joseph asked, we know budgets are roadblocks for left legislation, but is it sustainable to operate in a perpetual deficit, and why? I mean, you could operate in perpetual deficit. I think that there is a limit to how much of a deficit that we can sustain ourselves, just because, for things like stability of the currency, and also making sure that we're matching our productive capacities in the United States. So there are like limits to U.S. policy on that level, but what we get from the right wing and also like centrists, we are nowhere near the capacity of the United States to deficit spend. Though I don't think that that's the model that we should put forward as our main tool, is to do deficit spending. But there definitely is a lot more space than our opponents on the other side of the aisle say. All right. Donk Achino. Will Pepe Escobar be back on TMBS? Pepe Escobar is one of the more interesting guests that we get. One of the more interesting guests that we get on TMBS. I'd love to have him again. I'll have to try to see if we can reach out to him. I have to build a relationship with him, but I would love to be able to talk to him again. And I think that what's been happening in Cuba. So the question was, is the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, is he a revisionist? I don't think so. I think that would be the wrong way to frame it. I think that what's been happening in Cuba, especially lately, has been quite encouraging. The changes to their constitution, I thought, were very important for the country going forward, and just show that it has the kind of flexibility that's going to be necessary to maintain the Cuban system with ratcheted up pressure from the United States. And you just have to understand the parameters that Cuba is still operating under. You have this massive imperialist force right next to you that is getting more and more aggressive. And I think that domestically, Cuba is trying to fix some of the problems that came with the revolution, and trying to maintain the social and economic victories that were won under the revolution. Sorry. But that obviously that creates a kind of government that has to overstep its bounds, and it's a good thing to actually see the government walking back when it comes to issues of like freedom of speech and things of that nature. So I won't call them revisionists. I actually think that that's a success story of Cuba actually being able to walk back a kind of systems that were put in place basically to prevent United States interference domestically. Kowalski from Nebraska says the Supreme Court has no army nor police force. If it isn't legitimized by the president or Congress, it's worthless. Solidarity, comrades, Omaha, vote. I think he's 100% right. The fact that the Supreme Court has as much power as it does in our system is political victories for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court recognized when it was basically able to, under the Warren Court, that it could expand its powers dramatically. And the only way that you're going to be able to push back and fight that is to understand this is a political fight. Matt Karp's piece and Jackman, I highly suggest people read about how the radical Republicans in Lincoln, fought with the Supreme Court when they were trying to end slavery in this country. And you have to understand the Supreme Court as a political institution and not as something that's outside of politics, because that's the kind of liberal mythology around it. It's like something above politics, and that's just not the case. All right, I had some more questions here. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody as I go down. I appreciate Nancy for the love and support here. Those are always good super chats. Thank you so much for your support, and everybody for continuing to support the show going forward. Ashton says, what do you think about centering prison abolition over calls to jail killer cops? How can we expand popular understandings of justice? I think that the defund the police movement, we've seen significant victories lately on that front and setbacks. I think Austin is a really exciting model for how we can push a politics from just being a slogan into something that's material. But obviously, when you go into the political realm versus the kind of, just like the space of rhetoric and argument, that means things are going to change a bit. So there's lessons and there are defeats that we have to sort of recognize. But I think that the defund the police model, while not perfect, is a really great way at helping people start to understand the role of the police systemically in this country. Because when you say defund the police, people's first reaction is like, what do you mean? I want to have somebody call if my house gets broken into. And all of the people on the left, we all know that that's a kind of fantasy model in the first place, because the cops take forever to show up anyway, right? So that's like just very much like a movie dynamic, that the police are just going to show up in 10 minutes and, save you from a robber or a murderer in your house. But the fact is that people still do think of the police in this way. But what defund the police can do is it opens up the space for a conversation for people to understand, like, it doesn't make sense to have police, show up when somebody's having a mental health episode. people understand that. Actually, it's not that difficult, I think, to make that argument to folks. Most people have had really negative experiences with police officers as well. I think that, being able to start building those conversations with people and helping them understand that what the police force is used for in our system, which is, to break strikes, to attack working class communities. Obviously, it's very racialized in this country. Basically, the defund the police model says, here's a problem. And what we can do is we can move money from, negative activities, right? Which is having armed people showing up and, trying to deal with social programs, trying to deal with problems that should be, addressed by social programs. That helps people have a different mentality to policing. I think that really is the best, one of the best models to go forward with. I think that prison abolition is something that I agree with, to a certain extent, but I think that's a harder argument to get people in the door. And I actually think defund the police is a better entryway to have people start thinking about, a different kind of justice in this country. Patrick Gustavo says, weird fun fact, for all of his flaws, apparently Christopher Hitchens' final words were capitalism downfall. Yeah, I mean, I've heard this story too. I think everyone who listens to the show regularly knows that myself, Michael, and Ben all had, pretty significant Hitchens phases. Now, I don't need anyone in the comments to come in here and explain to me the problems with Hitchens' new atheism or his nasty support for the Iraq War. Obviously, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about when I was a younger person reading his essays and thinking he was a cool writer. So I've heard that story before. I wonder how valid it is. I'm sure we should see, Ben's working on a book on Christopher Hitchens, actually. I'm sure he'd be a good person to see how valid that claim is, but definitely could be interesting. Comrade Joseph says, what whiskey have you been drinking lately? I have been enjoying a whiskey a bourbon called Angel's Envy, sort of as a treat to myself once in a while. Very, very nice one. But, my go-tos are Buffalo Trace and Wild Turkey. All right, we got our comrade here, says, Comrade Anouk says, David, when we get a tier list, when do we get a tier list of S tier, also known as the best, to F tier, the worst, 20th to 21st century socialist leaders? I like that. Maybe we'll play that as a game in an upcoming post game. I appreciate that. So let's see. While I'm waiting for a couple more super chats, I wanted to, one thing, if you haven't already been checking out Ben's new show and podcast, Give Them an Argument, I highly suggest it. I've been doing a country music segment with him every week. We did Johnny Cash, we did Waylon Jennings, we did Blaze Foley, and I think this week we're going to do Terry Allen. So if you're interested in that at all, it's a fun thing for me. Oh, we did Willie Nelson as well, of course. For me to be able to just sort of kick back and talk a little bit about country music, a little bit about politics, but hoping to focus a little bit more on the music and those great stories. I think there is another piece I wanted to bring people's attention to, was a piece that came out recently. And I'm going to jump to Comrade Eric's question 1 second. There we go. Actually, you know what? I'll come back to, because I think Eric asked me a question on Facebook about, or made a point about Richard Seymour's piece. So I'll get back to that in a second. Let me answer these questions, actually. Comrade Tom from Yacubia, celebrating 420 forever, baby. I love it. Eric says, I enjoyed your Jackman streams. Can workers with left social values really formulate solidarity with those with reactionary right values? How? This is a good question, and I'm taking a pause to make sure that I articulate my thoughts correctly on this. I think that this kind of abstract way of thinking about it can be a little bit harmful, because what we tend to do is sort of imagine, like, imaginary, characters, right? Like, this hyper, stereotypical, Trump supporting Bubba guy, bigot, for, and then somebody who's like, very progressive, cappuccino sipping, Yankee liberal or whatever. I don't think that that's a good frame to think about. I think what you're hitting at, though, is like, how can we politically build these kind of coalitions? I think the best model that we have in this country from our history was the American populist movement, which was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But you have to remember, at a period of time when you're not, you're decades away from slavery, that they were able to build political coalitions of poor whites and poor blacks across the South. Now, these were not perfect, right? And, I think it'd be wrong for people to consider the American populist movement, especially in the Deep South, as being, kind of like racial liberals, right? There still were racist members, not all of them, but there definitely were. But what they were able to do was actually create a political community together based on their shared needs, and their shared needs were many. I think that's the kind of political model that we need to be building. And also, I think that when you start working together in social groups, those kind of nasty divides, they start to break down, right? And that's my hope. I definitely am somebody who believes that we can work our way through these problems, not ever being conciliatory, by the way, to bigots or racists or anything like that. That is not what I'm advocating. But I just think, that, it's really important that we understand that, life in politics is about building, and that we have the opportunity to build. And what we need to do is we need to have, common goals that speak to a lot of people. And that's how we're going to basically be able to break down a lot of those really nasty prejudices. That's sort of is my best hope. It's a difficult question. It's a difficult one to figure out, especially in abstract, but it's even more difficult to figure out in the concrete when it's happening in front of you. So I think that, we just need to be really smart to understand that there is a difference between cultural signals and overt racism and bigotry. I think, we're just going to have to start building a lot of understanding. But again, I don't think that this kind of political reality exists where you have 40% of the working class is just like bigots, right? I don't think that's the case. I think it's a smaller group than people imagine. And I don't think that we need to build our political movements about trying to cater to those interests at all. I guess the fundamental line that I would say is that I think that by building together, we can overcome that problem instead of overly anticipating it and preventing us from actually building community and political movements. Easy 1977, with Michael's passing. With Michael's passing, a majority report is missing an international perspective. What would it take for you to do some segments, maybe weekly or more often? I don't think, we're going to be able to you can't replace Michael's voice, especially on MR. I would suggest, tune into TMBS. I'm trying to do as much international coverage as possible. I'm hoping to do more of these live streams so we can get into these things. But I'm sure that Matt and the gang are stepping up too and trying to make sure that voice is continuing. But I appreciate the question and, and the recognition of Michael's very important contribution to that show and all the work that he did. Okay, sorry, scroll down too quickly. Here we go. I'm just reading this real quick. We have a question from Eric, Eakin, who is flattering me and then asking me a question. I'm not familiar with what you are pointing out to me right here. So you can ask me. I'll just read the question to folks. When it comes to Allende's, I'm not going to overstep my knowledge on this one. I think that's something that I need to look into to really be able to form an opinion. They basically asked me about Allende's specific Allende's specific economic platform in Chile, and what its meaning would be, or its value would be toward a socialist or communist movement. I'm not going to overstep my knowledge on this, so that's something that I would like to return to and come back to you with my thoughts on, instead of just spouting off nonsense right here. I really appreciate the question, and make sure I answer it going forward. JH, have you or anyone in the chat ever listened to Flights with Tools by the Flowbots? It's a great lefty band. They radicalized me in my teens. That sounds interesting. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if anyone in the chat is interested as well. All right, so we have a question from Matt Pierce that says, do you think Biden will escalate tensions with North Korea and to interfere with rapprochement in the peninsula? So I don't know if Biden has a specifically articulated platform when it comes to North Korea. I do know the problem with Joe Biden is that he is a hyper-reactionary, as you've seen even lately with him tweeting about Juan Guaido and, basically pushing for a coup in Venezuela, that this is not somebody who is going to be our friend. This is somebody who is going to continue the nastiest aspects of U.S. imperialism. So do I think that it's not that far off to think that Joe Biden is going to try to push back against what Trump was doing. What Trump was doing was obviously incoherent and nonsensical when it came to North Korea, but you saw how sick it made the liberals. It's not that unlikely that he would basically try to reverse course dramatically as a way to distinguish himself from Donald Trump, for example. That could be a problem. That's what we're going to have to push back as much as possible against the Joe Biden administration. Because he obviously is somebody who he's not going to take over the system and make it any better. I can promise you that. Yeah, I think it could be a Joe Biden administration could definitely be a problem for North Korea. I don't think that a Donald Trump administration is coherent enough to really be beneficial toward rapprochement either, though. That's something that we're gonna have to work on and push ourselves. Don Juan says, "Hey David, can you explain the end of Bretton Woods and the Fed's actions to curb stagflation in the 70s and early 80s? What should the left learn from it? You guys rule. Love the show." Well, I appreciate the the super chat and the love. So, the end of Bretton Woods, was obviously a massive shock to the global economy and to the economic system in general. Paul Volcker is somebody who is often praised on the left, more by centrists, but was quite nasty as a chair of the Federal Reserve. He's oftentimes praised for his bravery in fighting the inflation crisis. And don't get me wrong, he made plenty of enemies. Remember, capital is not united in what it wants, but basically he fought inflation with drastic measures. He used the power of the Federal Reserve to devastate American workers, and really brought in this era of financialized capitalism that we're living under today. That was the shift that you saw under Paul Volcker. Most notably, what he did was he raised interest rates dramatically. I think somewhere around 20%. Remember right now we're almost near 0%. So it's a very different kind of situation. And what that does is essentially it just zaps money out of the economy. And that was in his argument was to curb, inflation. But you also have to remember what was happening in the United States at that time is you were having a more powerful labor movement. And what Volcker was able to do, along with Reagan, was to crush that movement significantly. And they ushered in this kind of system that we're living in today, where you saw this destruction of the American, workforce, while you also saw this shift of the wealthy over into more, speculative activities. Which basically is the precursor for the system we're living today, where you very much have two different economic realities. I was talking about at the beginning of the stream, the reality that so many people right now are experiencing massive unemployment and low wages, while you have super wealthy folks, who are basically are profiting immensely from this pandemic. Two different economies, right? Supposedly under the same system, but that's because of the financialization that was brought under Paul Volcker. I'll remember this later. I did a pretty full recap of Paul Volcker on TMBS, I think in 2019, last year. We were still in the studio, I remember. So I'll see if I can find it, maybe put that on Twitter, but definitely check that out, because I've had to cover Volcker and his work a few times. All right, Tom Hall is telling me that Brian and Joaquin's super chats got missed 5 questions ago, donating $5 to help. Hey, really appreciate the super chat. Thanks for looking out for your friends. And let me see if I can. I'll see if I can scroll up. I'm sorry, it's a little bit wonky sometimes. Okay, Don Juan. Okay, I missed this person's. SM said, our Idaho Senator Jim Risch just refused to debate Dem challenger Paulette Jordan. Mainstream media ignores. Red states is unwilling to remove GOP incumbents. Wrong. I think you're absolutely right. Definitely check out my teacher and friend of the show, friend of Michael's, Luke Mayville's work. With Reclaim Idaho as well. Definitely. I think this, talked about this later, earlier in the show, but that's why I've been so adamant about. Okay, I found Brian saying, adamant about not writing off red states. I mean, obviously, if you're from a red state like I am and you are, you don't really have a choice. But there's a lot of kind of like liberals who just immediately write off red states, and that's ridiculous, obviously. So Brian, my parents are voting Trump because their 401k is tied to stocks and the stock market is doing well. What's a good rebuttal? Okay. I mean, that's a difficult one. I mean, first of all, I would say that, look, read the Financial Times today. Investors are getting pretty stoked about a Biden presidency. I can't imagine Biden being a problem for the rich. I mean, Biden was one of the, I mean, this might not be the argument to win your parents' favor because it's so negative, but maybe put a positive spin on this. Biden is just a complete whore for the credit card industries. I mean, he's from Delaware, which for people who don't know is where vast majority of American corporations exist. I mean, this guy is somebody who's so in bed with the rich and the financial interest in this country. He is not going to be a problem for them at all. I think that might be the argument that you have to make. I wouldn't want to be in that position, but if you gotta get people off of Trump, do what you need to do. But I'll as a second point, this is going back to the earlier question about Volcker, the end of Bretton Woods, and the changes that we saw in the 70s and the 80s, the real birth of neoliberalism. That is exactly what they did. By trying to turn homes, for example, into financialized assets, and then by trying to make sure that there's a small population of like the middle class, comfortable people, but not hyper wealthy, that started to feel that they had a need for the stock market, that they felt that their interests were aligned with the super rich. That was a tactical decision by the right, and by, centrist neoliberal Democrats as well, to basically tie in a small part of the middle class into, the interests of the financialized class as a whole, right? So basically you have super wealthy people making, absurd amounts of money on high asset prices, super inflated housing prices. people who were raking in millions and millions of dollars, and then you had people who were maybe pulling in, an extra $1,000 a year. But what they did very, astutely on their part was basically try to make the interest, even if they're really small for that group of people, tied to the hyper elite. And that's been the fundamental, Republican and also for certain members of the Democratic Party strategy as well. So basically tie in a small group of the middle class into the interest of the hyper wealthy. So that's why, your parents, might be, thinking the way that you mentioned. So Joaquin said, using Marx, how can we best explain that only two classes exist while maintaining nuance about the privileges of different workers, like PMC to newbies? Well, I would first say that I don't think that if you read Marx, considering he doesn't make the argument that there's only two classes. There are multiple classes in under capitalism even. But the two main actors in the system is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And I understand the spirit of your question because there are differences between people who are working, at a call center in this country, for example, and people who are sort of tied, to, upper middle class PMC kind of wage labor, right? Those are very different systems culturally and the way that they're exploited. But I think that the first thing you need to make with people is actually that the vast majority of people, even people who are well off, are being exploited under the system. It does not exploit people all in the same way, but there is a fundamental there's a fundamental theft to capitalism. There is a, an unethical aspect to it. It was that those who own the productive assets in society basically are able to extract all the surplus value from their workers. And that's just not right. The value that people are creating gets sucked up by the boss and the owners, right? I think that that's a kind of, easy argument for some people to understand. And then the cultural argument is more difficult. And I think the only way that you're going to get through that is with praxis, right? Is with building organizations and building solidarity and building understanding. I don't think that's something we're going to there's no one line to overcome 100 years of, bizarre capitalist developments in the United States that have completely divided the majority class in the society, right? There's not one quick argument that's going to blow that up. The only thing that's going to start to blow that up is by building organizations that are uniting people. I think, for example, building tenant associations is something that is great because, rich, upper middle class PMC types and poor are renting, right? And that's a growing population in this country. That is a nasty dynamic to deal with landlords, people who are exploiting you in that way. I think that that's a way that you can, overcome those developments. And that's the only way that you're really going to be able to do it, in my opinion. So I think the first broader argument, is that capitalism is a system that exploits the many for the benefit of the very few. And I think you can actually be quite broad in expressing the dynamic in that way. And then the second work is that we have to just unite people through political organizations that have real chances of winning, that show people that politics can change their lives. That's the only way we're going to be able to break down these kind of PMC, wage labor divide. Comrade Davey said, would you rather fight one David Feldman-sized duck or 100 duck-sized Feldmans? I might have to take the David Feldman-sized duck. Feldman, the thought of 100 duck-sized David Feldmans fills me with dread and despair. Well, I think this is a good place for me to stop. I really appreciate everybody showing up. I'm hoping to be able to do more of these. Definitely check out our show on Tuesday. I think we're trying to decide how we want to deal with the debate. We'll have an announcement on that soon. Check out my Jackman videos if you haven't checked them out already. Again, I really appreciate all of y'all, all the support. hit me up if you have any questions or anything you want covered on TMBS on Twitter, Instagram, how to find me. And, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/TMBS. I'll be on Ben's show tomorrow at 5:45, I think, talking about the Texas music legend Terry Allen. All right, everyone. Cheers and solidarity.